It's the early morning of August 15th, 1947. The air in Delhi is thick, a strange mix of celebration and sorrow. Men and women gather in silence as the Union Jack begins its slow descent from the flagpole. For the first time in nearly 200 years, that flag, the symbol of an empire that once ruled over a quarter of the world, is being lowered. Tears glisten in people's eyes. Some cry with joy, others with disbelief. To the world, it looks like an act of generosity, Britain granting freedom to India. But behind the pageantry lies a darker truth. Britain didn't give India independence. Britain was forced to let go, because by 1947, the world's richest empire was bankrupt. World War II had left Britain in ruins, its cities bombed, industries shattered, and national debt soaring to over 200% of GDP. The treasury was empty. The empire, once fueled by wealth from across the globe, was running on borrowed time and borrowed money. For nearly 2 centuries, India had been Britain's golden goose, a land overflowing with cotton, spices, silk, and taxes. Without India's wealth, there was no empire to sustain. So when the British finally left, it wasn't because of moral awakening. It was because greed had drained the empire dry. But how did the richest empire on earth reach a point where it couldn't even afford to hold on to its crown jewel? To understand that, we must go back to where it all began, to a single piece of paper that changed history. The year is 1600. Queen Elizabeth II signs a royal charter, granting a small group of English merchants exclusive trading rights with the East. They called it the East India Company. No one knew it then, but this company would become the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. At first, it was all about trade, silk, spices, and tea. But soon, the company realized that there was far more profit in control than in commerce. By the 18th century, this company had become something monstrous. It had its own army of 260,000 men, twice the size of Britain's national military. It minted its own currency, imposed its own laws, and even waged wars. A corporation had become an empire. The turning point came in 1757, at the Battle of Plassey. The company's forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal, and the British Crown granted it the right to collect taxes from more than 30 million Indians. In one stroke, the company stopped being a trader and became a ruler. What followed was one of the largest economic exploitations in history. The East India Company imposed monopolies on salt, tobacco, and opium, forcing Indian producers to sell their goods at crushed prices while taxing them into poverty. Farmers starved, artisans were ruined, and yet the company's profits soared. Between 1769 and 1770, Bengal was hit by one of the worst famines in history. Nearly 10 million people died, but the company didn't stop collecting taxes. They taxed people who were already dying. Villages disappeared, but London's coffers overflowed. This wasn't incompetence. It was policy. It was greed institutionalized, written into the DNA of empire. In the mid-1700s, India made up nearly a quarter of global industrial output. Its fabrics, metalwork, and craftsmanship were world famous. But by 1900, that number had fallen to just 2%. Why? Because Britain didn't just conquer India. It deindustrialized it. Indian goods were crushed under tariffs while British imports entered freely. Raw cotton was bought from India for pennies, shipped to Britain, turned into textiles, and then sold back to India at huge profits. The result was devastating. Generations of Indian weavers were driven to starvation, entire industries were wiped out, and Britain's factories, built on stolen wealth, became the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. By the mid-19th century, Britain was no longer just rich, it was addicted to extraction, and when one colony couldn't fill the appetite, the empire turned elsewhere, to China. The East India Company had found a new source of wealth, opium. Farmers in India were forced to grow it under brutal contracts. The drug was then smuggled into China in exchange for silver and tea, an illegal trade that made Britain billions. When China finally resisted, Britain declared war, the Opium Wars. They weren't fought for freedom or trade, they were fought for profit, and Britain won. By the mid-1800s, opium had become Britain's second largest source of government revenue, right after the land taxes collected from India. The empire wasn't built on gold or glory, it was built on addiction and blood. In 1857, the Indian soldiers serving under the East India Company rose up in revolt, one of the largest uprisings in colonial history. But Britain crushed it with overwhelming force. Villages were burned, thousands executed. And then came the ultimate insult. The cost of suppressing the rebellion was charged to Indian taxpayers. They had to pay for their own defeat. After that, the British Crown dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. But the exploitation didn't end. It only changed hands. Now it was official government policy. By the late 1800s, half of India's total revenue went to maintaining British military forces, most of which didn't even protect India. They existed to protect British interests from India. Britain often claims that it gave India railways, education, and modern infrastructure. But what's rarely mentioned is who paid for it. Between 1860 and 1890, India's rail network expanded rapidly, financed entirely by Indian debt, and every contract required that materials be purchased from Britain. So India borrowed the money, built the railways, and Britain pocketed the profit. These trains weren't built to connect Indians. They were built to move troops and goods. Steel tracks laid across a starving nation. Economist Dadabhai Nauroji called it the drain of wealth. He estimated that Britain extracted 30 to 40 million from India every year, while reinvesting less than 250,000. He compared the relationship to vampirism, a parasite feeding on its host until it's too weak to resist. Then came the World Wars, and with them, the empire's final unraveling. During World War I, over 1 million Indian soldiers fought across Europe and the Middle East for the British Crown. More than 150,000 were killed or wounded. India also shipped food, timber, and supplies, most of it paid for by Indian taxpayers. And as a thank you, Britain forced India to donate £100 million to the war effort. By World War II, the numbers were staggering. The British Indian Army swelled to 3.3 million men, the largest volunteer force in history. Britain financed its war by issuing sterling balances, IOUs owed to India. By 1945, India had become Britain's biggest creditor. And yet, the empire still treated India as expendable. During the Bengal famine of 1943, up to 3.8 million people died as Britain diverted food supplies to Europe. When told about the famine, Winston Churchill mocked the victims, saying Indians breed like rabbits. The truth was clear. The empire would rather let millions die than risk its war economy. By the end of the war, Britain was finished. Its debt was twice the size of its economy. Its colonies were restless, and its allies, especially the United States, were no longer willing to fund imperialism. America loaned Britain $3.75 billion, and Canada added another $1.9 billion just to keep it afloat. It would take Britain until 2006 to finally pay those loans off. But the empire itself didn't survive that long. Without India's wealth, the global machinery that powered British dominance simply collapsed. On June 3, 1947, Britain announced its withdrawal from India. By August 15th, the flag came down. It wasn't a gift, it was surrender, economic, moral, and political. In 1700, India made up 27% of global GDP. By 1947, that number had fallen to 4%. Meanwhile, Britain's share had risen from 3% to nearly 9%, all built on stolen labor, stolen wealth, and stolen lives. For 200 years, Britain's rise was India's decline. When the drain stopped, so did the empire. When India finally took control of its destiny, it began to heal from centuries of economic bleeding. In 1947, the average life expectancy in India was just 27 years. Today, it's over 70. In less than a century of self-rule, India achieved more growth, education, and health reform than Britain ever gave in 2 centuries of civilization. Britain had won wars but lost its soul. It had conquered the world, only to be conquered by its own greed. Empires don't fall overnight. They bleed out slowly, through arrogance, overspending, and the illusion that power lasts forever. The British Empire's collapse offers a warning, not just to the past, but to the present. Because today, the United States stands where Britain once stood. A global superpower with 750 overseas bases, trillions in war debt, and a financial system stretched to the limit. Britain's power was built on colonies. America's is built on the dollar, on its dominance over global trade and finance. But history is a cycle. When debts rise, trust erodes, and power shifts, the pattern repeats. Britain's debt reached 200% of GDP in 1945. America's today isn't far behind. The same arrogance, the same illusion of permanence, and the same fate waiting in the shadows. Because greed always ends the same way. The British Empire's downfall wasn't just financial, it was moral. It believed it could drain the world forever, and that the bill would never come due. But it did. When the sun finally set on the British Empire, it didn't sink into the sea. It sank into its own reflection, into the greed, arrogance, and blindness that had defined it. And maybe, just maybe, the next empire should pay attention before history rhymes again. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because history isn't just about the past, it's a mirror of our future. This is Pastify Hub, uncovering the untold stories behind the rise and fall of empires.